In 1975, a 24-year-old engineer at Eastman Kodak built the world's first digital camera inside his company's own laboratory. Nobody asked him to do it. When he finished, he carried it into a conference room and showed it to his managers. The device weighed 8 pounds, took black and white pictures, and stored each image on a cassette tape. It took 23 seconds to record a single photograph. And when the executives in that room finally understood what they were looking at, they told him to put it away and not tell anyone. At its peak, Kodak controlled 90% of the American film market and 85% of all camera sales in the United States. The yellow box sat in kitchen drawers from Maine to California. It went on family road trips, to Little League games, to Christmas mornings, to graduations. More than 60,000 people in Rochester, New York woke up every morning and went to work because of that name. The fifth most valuable brand in the world, a company worth $31 billion. At 1 in the morning on January 19, 2012, Kodak filed for bankruptcy. How does the company that invented the future end up destroyed by it? This is not a story about film. It is a story about the yellow box that lived in your family's drawer and what happened to the people who put it there. George Eastman was not supposed to change the world. He was a bank clerk from Rochester, New York, who had dropped out of school at 14 to support his widowed mother and 2 sisters after his father died and left the family with nothing. He was quiet, methodical, and relentlessly self-educated. At night, after long days at the Rochester Savings Bank, he taught himself accounting. He read, he saved. He did not complain. And in 1877, when a colleague suggested he bring a camera along on a planned trip to Santo Domingo, George Eastman bought a complete photographic outfit, and the trip never happened. But the camera changed everything. What Eastman encountered was not photography as most people imagine it today. It was a full-scale chemical operation. A wet plate photographer in 1877 needed a wooden camera the size of a small suitcase, a portable darkroom tent, glass plates coated with silver nitrate solution, and enough chemical supplies to stock a small laboratory. Every photograph had to be taken, developed, and fixed before the wet plate dried, sometimes within minutes. It was expensive, physically demanding, and completely inaccessible to anyone without professional training. Eastman looked at all of it and saw not a hobby but a problem waiting to be solved. He began spending his evenings in his mother's kitchen in Rochester, experimenting with gelatin emulsions that could replace the wet plates entirely. The kitchen table disappeared under glass, chemicals, and handwritten notes. His mother worked around him. He stayed up past midnight, night after night, mixing formulas, testing coatings, starting over. He was 23 years old and had no formal training in chemistry. What he had was something rarer, an absolute conviction that photography was too important to remain the exclusive possession of experts and wealthy hobbyists. He believed, with the certainty of a man who had grown up without much, that ordinary people deserved to hold their own memories in their hands. By 1880, Eastman had invented and patented a dry plate coating machine, a device that could mechanically produce ready-to-use photographic plates in volume, eliminating the need for on-site chemical preparation. He set up his first operation in April of that year above a music store in the financial district of Rochester, selling plates to professional photographers. The following January, with the financial backing of a local businessman named Henry Strong, who had made his money manufacturing buggy whips, Eastman founded the Eastman Dry Plate Company. He resigned from the bank the same year. He was 26 years old. He never looked back. But dry plates were still heavy, still fragile, still the equipment of professionals. Eastman kept pushing. In 1884, working with camera inventor William Hall Walker, he developed a roll film holder that allowed photographers to advance flexible paper film through a camera rather than handle individual plates. It was a mechanical leap that would define the basic architecture of cameras for the next 100 years. And in 1885, he bought the patents for roll film from inventor David Houston and developed them further into something more practical, more durable, more ready for the world he was imagining. That world arrived in 1888. Eastman introduced the first Kodak camera, a small, simple box loaded with enough roll film for 100 exposures priced at $25. When the film was finished, the photographer mailed the entire camera back to Rochester. For $10, Kodak developed the film, made the prints, reloaded the camera with fresh film, and sent everything back. The slogan Eastman wrote himself captured the philosophy in 7 words. You press the button, we do the rest. The name Kodak was his own invention. He devised it with his mother using an anagram set built around the letter K, his favorite letter. He described it as strong and incisive. It was also meaningless in every language on earth, which meant it could belong to no country and travel anywhere. Eastman understood branding the way few businessmen of his era did. He understood that the name had to feel like something before anyone knew what it meant. What Eastman had built was not merely a camera company. He had built a system, a complete vertically integrated pipeline from film manufacturing to processing to delivery, designed so that the customer never had to think about chemistry, mechanics, or technique. The complexity was entirely his problem. The memory was entirely theirs. For the first time in history, an ordinary person could point a small handheld device at their child, their garden, their front porch on a summer afternoon, press a single button, and receive a permanent record of that moment in the mail 2 weeks later. Photography had belonged to the few. George Eastman decided it would belong to everyone. He was a man who had grown up without photographs of his own father. Perhaps that was where it started. In February of 1900, Eastman Kodak introduced a camera that cost $1. It was called the Brownie. It was a small cardboard box with a simple lens, designed by Kodak engineer Frank Brownell, and it came loaded with roll film that cost 15 cents a roll. It was marketed directly at children. The first 5,000 units sent to dealers sold out immediately. By the end of the following year, nearly 250,000 had been sold. Within 5 years, 10 million brownies had found their way into American homes. Photography was no longer a hobby for the wealthy. It was something a child could do on a Saturday afternoon. What the brownie created was not just a product category, it created a cultural habit. For the first time, ordinary American families began to build visual records of their own lives. Birthdays, summers, first days of school, the dog in the backyard, the grandmother on the porch. These were not posed portraits taken in a studio by a professional. They were snapshots, candid and imperfect and irreplaceable, taken by people who had never held a camera before and would hold one for the rest of their lives. Kodak called them snapshots. America adopted the word and never let it go. The Brownie was so successful that it created a problem Eastman had not fully anticipated. Many customers were perfectly satisfied with the cheap little box and never graduated to more expensive Kodak equipment. The company eventually repositioned the Brownie as an entry-level product in a broader lineup, but the lesson it had taught the world was already permanent. Photography was for everyone. Kodak had said so, and Kodak had meant it. Through the first decades of the 20th century, the company continued to expand its hold on American life in ways both visible and invisible. Kodak supplied the film stock that made Hollywood possible. Thomas Edison's early motion pictures ran on Kodak film. The newsreel footage of World War I that Americans watched in darkened theaters was shot on Kodak stock. When a 17-year-old Canadian girl named Bernice Palmer boarded the SS Carpathia in April of 1912 and found herself surrounded by survivors pulled from the wreckage of the Titanic, she had a brand new Brownie camera with her, a birthday gift. The photographs she took that morning are among the only visual records that exist of the disaster survivors. A $1 camera made by a bank clerk from Rochester captured one of the defining tragedies of the century. By the 1950s and 1960s, Kodak had become something that no amount of advertising could have manufactured on its own. It had become a ritual. The yellow box of Kodak film was as much a part of the American household as the kitchen table or the family car. You bought it before vacations. You kept a spare roll in the glove compartment. You dropped the finished canister in a small paper envelope at the pharmacy counter on a Tuesday, and you came back the following week to pick up your photographs. A small orange or yellow packet, slightly fatter than you expected, containing proof that your life was worth documenting. The waiting was part of it. You did not know exactly what you had until you opened that envelope. Sometimes you were disappointed. Sometimes a photograph was there that you had forgotten taking, and it stopped you completely. Then came Kodachrome. Introduced in 1935, Kodachrome was the first commercially successful color film for amateur and professional photographers alike. Its color rendition was unlike anything that had existed before, rich, saturated, warm, with an archival stability that allowed images to survive for decades without fading. Professional photographers understood immediately what they had been given. National Geographic built much of its visual identity on Kodachrome. Life magazine's most iconic images were shot on it, but it was also the film in the family camera at the beach in 1962, in the mountains in 1971, at the backyard barbecue in 1978. The particular warmth of Kodachrome color, those deep greens and golden yellows and clear open skies, became the visual language of American memory for nearly half a century. When people today describe how the past looked, they are often describing, without knowing it, the color palette of Kodachrome film. In 1963, Kodak introduced the Instamatic camera. The Instamatic used a drop-in film cartridge that eliminated the need to thread film onto a take-up spool, a small mechanical change that removed the last remaining technical barrier between an ordinary person and a working camera. You dropped in the cartridge. You closed the camera. You pointed and shot. Tens of millions of Instamatics sold worldwide through the 1960s and 1970s. It was the camera at the birthday party, the graduation, the family reunion. It was the camera your father held at arm's length, squinting into the sun, telling everyone to move a little to the left. What was it about that yellow box that made an entire generation feel that the moment in front of them was worth saving? The answer was not the technology. The technology was the means. What Kodak had actually sold for nearly a century was the conviction that ordinary life was worth remembering, that a Tuesday afternoon in the backyard, a child's gap-toothed smile, a grandmother standing in her garden in the last summer before she died, that these things mattered, that they deserved to exist beyond the moment. Kodak did not invent memory, but for a very long time, it was the company that helped America keep it. By the 1970s, the Sunday evening slideshow had become its own American institution. The Kodak Carousel slide projector, introduced in 1961, sat in living rooms across the country, loaded with small plastic trays holding 80 or more transparencies. After dinner, someone would dim the lights, the projector would hum to life, and the wall would fill with the summer vacation from 3 years ago. The Christmas from before the kids got so big. The trip to Yellowstone that everyone remembered differently until the photographs proved who was right. The carousel was not just a projector. It was a time machine, and it ran on Kodak film. In 1973, Paul Simon released a song called Kodachrome. It went to #2 on the Billboard Hot 100. Its opening lines, about the way Kodachrome gave you nice bright colors and the greens of summers, were not advertising copy. They were nostalgia. They were a love letter from a generation to the film that had colored their childhood. A private company's proprietary product had become so woven into American experience that a major recording artist could name a song after it, and every person listening knew exactly what he meant. That does not happen by accident. That happens when a brand stops being a product and becomes part of how people understand their own lives. At its peak in 1976, Kodak held 90% of film sales and 85% of camera sales in the United States. In Rochester, New York, the company employed more people than the University of Rochester. Rochester Regional Health and Wegmans Food Markets combined would employ decades later. Generations of Rochester families had one member who worked at Kodak, then another, then another. It was the kind of company that people did not just work for. They belonged to. It paid well, offered pensions, provided health care, gave its workers a sense that their labor was part of something that mattered to the country. And for a very long time, it was. But somewhere in the mid-1970s, quietly in a laboratory that most people at Kodak had never visited, something had already happened that would eventually take all of it apart. Nobody outside that room knew about it yet. The customers buying yellow boxes at the pharmacy had no idea. The families loading their Instamatics for summer vacation had no idea. Even most of the people who worked at Kodak had no idea. The future had already been invented, and the people who invented it had decided to look the other way. By the time George Eastman died in March of 1932, leaving behind a note that read simply, "My work is done. Why wait?" The company he had built from a kitchen table and a set of borrowed chemistry books had become one of the most powerful industrial organisms in the United States. It was not merely a camera company. It was not merely a film company. It was a fully integrated empire that controlled every step of the photographic process, from the chemicals that coated the film to the paper that held the finished print. Eastman had not just invented a product, he had invented an ecosystem, and he had designed it so that once a customer stepped inside it, there was no reason to ever step out. The model was elegant in its simplicity. The cameras were sold cheaply, sometimes at a loss, because the cameras were not the point. The film was the point. Every roll of Kodak film a customer bought, every canister they dropped at the pharmacy counter, every print they picked up a week later, all of it fed a pipeline that Kodak owned entirely. They made the film. They coated the paper. They supplied the chemistry to the processing labs. They manufactured the projectors. They built the printing equipment that drugstores and photolabs used to produce finished prints. A customer who bought a Kodak camera in 1955 and used it faithfully for the next 20 years generated revenue for Kodak at every single step, in ways they never thought about and never needed to. That was the genius of the system. The customer only ever had to do one thing: press the button. Kodak did the rest. This model generated margins that most American industries could only dream about. At its peak, the gross margin on Kodak film sales approached 70%. Not revenue, margin. For every dollar a customer spent on a yellow box of Kodak film, 70 cents was profit. The company was not merely successful. It was a machine that printed money, and the money it printed was denominated in something as universal and inexhaustible as human memory. As long as people wanted to remember their lives, Kodak would prosper. And for most of the 20th century, that assumption seemed as permanent as gravity. The physical scale of what Kodak built in Rochester was staggering. The company's industrial campus, eventually known as Kodak Park, sprawled across hundreds of acres on the west side of the city. It had its own power plant, its own fire department, its own railroad connections. At its peak employment in 1982, Kodak had 60,400 workers in the Rochester metropolitan area alone, a number that exceeded the combined current workforce of the three largest employers in Rochester today. The city did not merely depend on Kodak. In a very real sense, the city was Kodak. The tax base, the schools, the hospitals, the cultural institutions, all of it was funded, directly or indirectly, by the company that George Eastman had built above a music store on a Rochester street corner a century before. Kodak also moved aggressively beyond American borders from an early stage. In 1891, the company opened a manufacturing facility in Harrow, England, making it one of the first American corporations to establish overseas production before the turn of the century. By the early 20th century, Kodak had distribution networks across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The yellow box was not an American product that happened to sell abroad. It was a global standard. In countries where photography was still a luxury, Kodak film was the aspiration. In countries where it was commonplace, Kodak was the default. The brand crossed language barriers the way almost no consumer product of its era managed to do, because the need it served, the desire to hold on to a moment before it disappeared, was not American. It was human. Through the mid-20th century, Kodak expanded its product line in ways that deepened its grip on both the consumer and professional markets. The company supplied film stock to Hollywood studios at a time when American cinema was the most powerful cultural export in the world. It produced aerial surveillance film for the United States military during World War II. It developed medical X-ray film that became standard equipment in hospitals across the country. It manufactured the film used in the space program. The photographs of Earth taken from orbit in the 1960s and 1970s, images that changed how an entire civilization understood its own fragility, were captured on Kodak film. The company was not a peripheral player in American life. It was woven into the country's most consequential moments, public and private, from the family vacation to the moon landing. The Super 8 home movie camera, introduced in 1965, brought motion picture filmmaking into American living rooms for the first time. Families across the country began shooting their own footage: birthday parties, holidays, children learning to walk, summer afternoons that would otherwise have existed only in memory. The film for those cameras was Kodak film, the projectors that played the footage back on Friday nights, the white bed sheet pinned to the wall in the basement, the slightly underexposed footage of a child running toward the camera with arms outstretched. All of it ran on the chemistry that Kodak's scientists had spent decades perfecting. By 1988, Kodak employed 145,300 people worldwide. Its research laboratories in Rochester were among the most productive industrial science facilities in the country, generating patents in chemistry, optics, and imaging technology at a rate that kept competitors perpetually behind. The company added to the Dow Jones Industrial Average in 1930, where it would remain for 74 consecutive years. For most of that time, it was not merely listed on the Dow. It was one of the companies that defined what American industrial strength meant. But inside that enormous, prosperous, seemingly invulnerable machine, a structural weakness had been quietly calcifying for decades. The very thing that made Kodak so powerful, its absolute dependence on film, was also the thing that would make it impossible to change when change became necessary. 80% of the company's profits came from film. Not cameras, not services, not patents. Film. A single product, sold in a yellow box, consumed and discarded and repurchased in an endless cycle that had run without interruption for nearly a century. When that cycle stopped, there would be nothing underneath it. The peak was still ahead, but the architecture of the fall was already in place. By the mid-1970s, Kodak had achieved something that no marketing campaign could manufacture and no competitor could replicate. It had achieved invisibility, not the invisibility of irrelevance, the invisibility of necessity. Like running water or electric light, Kodak had become so fundamental to the texture of American daily life that most people never thought about it at all. They simply used it. They bought the yellow box at the pharmacy without looking at the price. They dropped the canister in the envelope without reading the instructions. They picked up their photographs a week later and sat down at the kitchen table and went through them one by one, passing the good ones around, laughing at the bad ones, setting aside the ones that were too important to throw away and too personal to show anyone. This was not brand loyalty. This was habit, and habit, when it runs deep enough, becomes identity. In 1976, independent researchers confirmed what everyone in Rochester already knew. Kodak held 90% of film sales in the United States. It controlled 85% of all camera sales. Those numbers had not been achieved through aggressive pricing or clever promotions. They had been earned over nearly a century of consistent quality, relentless distribution, and a marketing philosophy that understood, earlier than almost any other American company, that the most powerful thing you could sell a person was not a product, but a feeling. Kodak did not advertise film. It advertised moments. It advertised the particular ache of time passing and the particular comfort of having proof that something beautiful once existed. Every Kodak advertisement from the 1950s onward was, at its core, a meditation on mortality dressed in primary colors and warm light. The most celebrated expression of that philosophy came in 1975, when Kodak launched an advertising campaign built around a song called Try to Remember, and later anchored by Paul Anka's recording of Times of Your Life. The campaign ran for years. It showed fathers watching daughters grow up. It showed grandmothers holding newborns. It showed summer afternoons that were already ending in the moment they were captured. The tagline was simple: for the times of your life. It did not mention film speed or exposure settings or price per roll. It mentioned nothing technical at all. It simply reminded every American watching that their life was passing, that the people they loved would not always be the age they were right now, and that a yellow box of Kodak film was the closest thing to stopping time that any ordinary person could afford. People did not watch that advertisement and think about photography. They thought about their mothers. They thought about their children. They reached for a tissue. The Kodak carousel slide projector, which the company had introduced in 1961, had by the 1970s become a fixture of the American middle-class home in the same way that the television set had. Families loaded their carousels with trays of Kodachrome transparencies and gathered in darkened living rooms to watch their own past projected onto the wall. There was a specific sound to those evenings. The mechanical click and hum of the carousel advancing, the slight whir of the cooling fan, the rectangle of warm light opening onto a frozen summer. Children fell asleep in those rooms. Grandparents grew quiet. The carousel did not merely show photographs. It created a ceremony around remembering, and Kodak film was the substance from which that ceremony was made. By 1988, the company employed 145,300 people worldwide and stood as one of the most recognized brand names on earth. In Rochester, 3 generations of the same family could work for Kodak, and frequently did. A grandfather who had started on the production floor in the 1940s might retire with a full pension while his son managed a processing division and his daughter worked in the research laboratories. Kodak was not a place people passed through. It was a place people arrived at and stayed because it offered something that most American employers of the era had stopped offering: stability. Real, lasting, generational stability. Good wages, comprehensive health care, a defined pension, and the quiet pride of working for a company that the entire world knew by name. What it felt like to work at Kodak at the height of its power was something that former employees would spend decades trying to describe to people who had not experienced it. Rochester was not merely a company town in the pejorative sense. It was a city that had been genuinely elevated by the presence of a great institution. The schools were well funded. The arts were supported. The University of Rochester's Medical Center, one of the finest in the country, existed in part because of George Eastman's extraordinary philanthropy. The Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra, which Eastman had founded in 1922, was still playing. The George Eastman Museum, housed in the founder's former mansion on East Avenue, held one of the most important collections of photographic history in the world. The man had been dead since 1932, and his fingerprints were still on everything. Then in the summer of 1984, something happened in Los Angeles that almost nobody noticed at the time. The Summer Olympics came to California, and with them came one of the most coveted sponsorship opportunities in the history of American advertising. The official film of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, the product that would be seen in the hands of athletes, spectators, and journalists across 2 weeks of the most watched sporting event on earth, was up for grabs. Kodak, the dominant American film company, the brand that had supplied every major American public event for a century, was offered the sponsorship, and Kodak declined. The price, the company's leadership decided, was too high. Fujifilm took the deal. For 2 weeks in the summer of 1984, the green and white logo of a Japanese film company appeared in venues across Los Angeles, while the American athletes competed for gold. Fujifilm's American market share, which had been negligible, began to climb. Consumers who had never considered an alternative to the yellow box began to notice that there was one. It was a small crack, barely visible, the kind of thing that a company as large and as dominant as Kodak could absorb without difficulty, or so it seemed. But cracks do not always announce themselves when they begin. In December of 1975, a young electrical engineer named Stephen Sasson sat in a small laboratory at Kodak's research facility in Rochester and finished assembling a device that had never existed before. It weighed 8 pounds. It was roughly the size of a toaster. It used a Fairchild semiconductor charge-coupled device as its image sensor, stored data on a standard cassette tape, and took 23 seconds to record a single black and white photograph at a resolution of 1/100th of a megapixel. To view the image, you had to connect the device to a television set and wait for the picture to resolve on screen. It was crude, slow, and impractical by any measure that mattered to the consumer market of 1975. It was also the first self-contained portable digital camera ever built, and Sasson had built it inside the walls of the company that would one day be destroyed by what it represented. Nobody had asked him to build it. Sasson had been assigned to work with a new type of image sensor and had followed the engineering logic wherever it led. When it led to a working prototype, he did what any engineer would do. He reported his findings to his superiors. He carried the device into a conference room, set it up, took photographs of the people in the room, played the images back on a television screen, and waited for a reaction. The reaction he received was not enthusiasm. It was not alarm. It was a kind of polite, deeply uncomfortable silence, followed by a question that would echo through the next 4 decades of American business history. Why would anyone want to look at their photographs on a television set? The executives in that room were not stupid men. They understood, on some level, that what Sasson had shown them was a glimpse of a possible future. What they could not bring themselves to fully confront was what that future meant for the present. Film was generating margins approaching 70%. The processing pipeline was generating revenue at every stage. The yellow box was in 90% of American homes. Everything was working. Everything was profitable. Everything made sense. And here was a 24-year-old engineer with a toaster-sized contraption suggesting, without quite saying it, that all of it might one day be unnecessary. Kodak patented the technology in 1978. They locked the patent away. They told Sasson to keep quiet about it, and they went back to selling film. What happened in that conference room in 1975 was not a single catastrophic decision. It was the first expression of an institutional reflex that would repeat itself in different forms for the next 30 years. The reflex was this: when the future threatened the present, protect the present. It was not greed exactly, and it was not stupidity. It was something more human and more insidious. It was the inability of people who had built something genuinely great to believe that the thing they had built could become obsolete. Kodak's leadership had spent their careers inside a system so profitable, so dominant, and so deeply embedded in American life that the idea of its irrelevance was simply not a thought the organizational mind could complete. The internal evidence that the future was arriving was not hidden. In 1981, Kodak's own research division produced a detailed internal report that analyzed the trajectory of digital imaging technology and projected, with considerable accuracy, that digital photography would begin displacing film within 10 to 15 years. The report was read, it was discussed, and then the company chose to interpret its conclusions as an argument for continuing to invest in film while slowly, cautiously, minimally preparing for a digital transition that nobody in a position of authority genuinely believed would happen on the timeline the report described. A former senior engineer later described the culture in those years with a precision that stings: bureaucratic, slow-moving, patronizing, and isolated. A company so accustomed to winning that it had forgotten how to be afraid. How long could a brand this powerful, this loved, this deeply woven into the fabric of American memory hold itself together against a force it had already seen coming? Meanwhile, outside the walls of Kodak's Rochester campus, the world was beginning to move. In 1981, Sony introduced the Mavica, an electronic still camera that stored images on a small magnetic disc. It was not a true digital camera by modern definition, and its image quality was far below the standard of film, but it demonstrated publicly, for the first time, that photography without film was a real possibility, and not a laboratory curiosity. The photography press covered it extensively. Kodak's leadership noted it, assessed it, and concluded that the image quality gap between electronic and film photography was too large to close within any commercially relevant timeframe. They were not entirely wrong about the gap. They were catastrophically wrong about the timeframe. The Fujifilm problem, which had begun with the 1984 Olympic sponsorship, continued to deepen through the latter half of the decade. Fuji's American market share climbed steadily through the mid-1980s, driven by competitive pricing and a willingness to invest aggressively in distribution. Kodak responded with price cuts and marketing campaigns and retained its dominant position, but the margin of dominance had begun to narrow in ways that the annual reports did not fully capture. Fuji was not winning on quality. Fuji was winning on the growing suspicion among American consumers that there might be no meaningful difference between the yellow box and the green one, and that the green one cost less. By the early 1990s, Kodak's revenues were approaching $19 billion, and the company's stock was trading near its all-time high. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. The yellow boxes were still moving off pharmacy shelves by the millions. The processing labs were still running. The Rochester workforce was still enormous. But inside the organization, in the laboratories, in the boardrooms, in the middle management corridors where the real decisions about the future were made, a quiet argument had been running for years between the people who believed that digital was coming and the people who needed it not to be. and the wrong side was winning. The customers had no idea. That was the particular cruelty of what was coming. The people who had trusted Kodak with their memories for 3 generations, who had built their rituals around the yellow box and the weekly trip to the pharmacy counter, were living inside a golden age that was already over. They just didn't know it yet. In 1996, Eastman Kodak Company reached the summit of everything George Eastman had set out to build. Revenue hit nearly $16 billion. The stock traded above $90 a share. The company's market capitalization exceeded $31 billion. It was the 5th most valuable brand in the world, sitting alongside Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Disney, and Marlboro in the rankings of global brand equity. 145,000 people worked for the company worldwide. In Rochester, Kodak was not merely the largest employer. It was the institutional heart of an entire city, the source of its prosperity, the foundation of its identity, the reason its hospitals were well-funded and its orchestra kept playing and its neighborhoods stayed intact. From the outside in 1996, Eastman Kodak looked like a company that would exist forever. Inside, the machine was eating itself. The central problem was one that the company's own analysts understood with perfect clarity and that its leadership was constitutionally incapable of acting upon. Film was dying. Not quickly, not visibly, not in ways that showed up dramatically in the quarterly numbers. Not yet. But the trajectory was established, the direction was fixed, and the people who had spent their careers building the film business could not bring themselves to be the ones who dismantled it. The gross margins on film approached 70%. Every time a Kodak executive looked at a proposal to accelerate the company's digital transition, they were looking at a proposal to voluntarily walk away from the most profitable product in the history of consumer photography. The numbers made the argument for inaction every single time, and every single time, the numbers won. What made this failure so extraordinary, so perfectly, almost classically tragic, was that Kodak was not blind to the future. They had invented it. Steven Sassen's digital camera prototype had been sitting in a Kodak patent file since 1978. The company's own research laboratories had been developing digital imaging technologies throughout the 1980s. By 1991, Kodak had introduced the first professional digital camera system, the DCS-100, built in collaboration with Nikon and aimed at photojournalists. By 1994, Kodak was manufacturing digital cameras for Apple under the QuickTake brand. By 1999, Kodak was the second largest seller of digital cameras in the United States. The technology was there. The engineering talent was there. The brand recognition was there. Everything necessary to lead the digital revolution was present inside the walls of Kodak's Rochester campus. What was missing was the willingness to let film die. Every digital camera Kodak sold in the late 1990s cannibalized its own film business. The company understood this with mathematical precision. Internal projections showed that for every digital camera sold, a predictable volume of film sales was lost, not immediately, but over the lifetime of the customer's relationship with photography. The faster Kodak pushed into digital, the faster it accelerated its own film revenue decline. And so the company did what large, profitable institutions do when faced with a choice between a certain present and an uncertain future. It hedged. It moved into digital slowly, cautiously, always with one eye on the film margins, always pulling back from full commitment at the moment when full commitment was the only thing that could have saved it. By 1999, Kodak was losing $60 on every digital camera it sold. The company was the second largest player in a market it should have owned outright, competing against Canon, Sony, Nikon, and a growing roster of Japanese electronics manufacturers who had no film business to protect and therefore no reason to hold back. Those companies were not managing a transition. They were building a new industry from scratch, and they were moving with the speed and hunger of organizations that had nothing to lose. Kodak was managing a transition with the caution of an organization that had everything to lose, which meant, in practice, that it was managing itself into irrelevance one careful quarter at a time. Who exactly was supposed to protect the people who had built this company? The engineers, the factory workers, the processing lab technicians? The Rochester families who had given their working lives to the yellow box? From decisions being made in boardrooms where the primary concern was the next earnings call? The answer, it turned out, was nobody. In 2000, Kodak appointed Daniel Karp as its new chief executive. Karp was a Kodak lifer, a career company man who understood the film business deeply and believed with genuine conviction that a managed transition to digital was still achievable. He accelerated investment in digital products, launched a major restructuring, and cut thousands of jobs in an attempt to reduce the cost structure enough to survive on shrinking film margins while building digital revenue. It was a rational strategy executed by a capable man against a tide that had already turned. Between 2003 and 2011, under Karp and his successor Antonio Perez, Kodak would close 13 manufacturing plants, shut down 130 processing labs, and eliminate 47,000 jobs. The Rochester that had once been built on Kodak's prosperity was being dismantled, neighborhood by neighborhood, family by family, one layoff notice at a time. Antonio Perez arrived as chief executive in 2005, recruited from Hewlett-Packard with a mandate to complete the digital transformation that his predecessors had started too late. Perez made a decision that would define his tenure and accelerate Kodak's collapse. He bet the company on printer ink. The logic was structurally similar to the old film model. Sell the hardware cheaply, make the money on the consumable. Kodak printers were priced higher than competitors, but the ink cartridges were cheaper, an explicit rejection of the razor and blades model that Hewlett-Packard had used to dominate the printer market for 2 decades. It was a reasonable theory. The execution was a disaster. The printer market was already saturated with entrenched competitors. Kodak was entering a brutal, margin-compressed industry with a contrarian pricing strategy at precisely the moment when printed photographs were being replaced by screens. Hundreds of millions of dollars burned through the strategy before the company finally abandoned the consumer inkjet business in September of 2012. While already in bankruptcy proceedings, through all of it, the Rochester workforce bore the weight of decisions made far above them. People who had spent 20 and 30 years on the production floor, who had planned their retirements around Kodak pensions, who had sent their children to college on Kodak salaries, found themselves watching the company contract around them like a tide going out. The ones who kept their jobs lived with the particular anxiety of survivors, grateful, guilty, and never entirely certain that the next round of cuts would not find them. The ones who lost their jobs faced a Rochester economy that had been so thoroughly shaped by Kodak's dominance that it had never fully developed the industrial diversity that might have absorbed them. The company that had built the city was now, slowly and systematically, hollowing it out. None of this was secret. The decline of Kodak was reported extensively in the business press throughout the 2000s. Analysts wrote about the innovator's dilemma. Professors used Kodak as a case study in MBA classrooms across the country. The story of the company that had invented digital photography and then failed to commercialize it had become one of the defining parables of the technology era, taught alongside the fall of Wang Laboratories and the stumbles of IBM as evidence that no market position, however dominant, was permanent. Kodak's management read these analyses. They understood what was being said about them, and they continued for years to believe that the next restructuring, the next product launch, the next strategic pivot would be the one that turned the tide. It never was. By 2011, Kodak had not recorded an annual profit since 2004. Its cash reserves were nearly exhausted. The company had begun exploring the sale of its patent portfolio, more than 1,000 patents accumulated over a century of genuine innovation, as a last attempt to generate enough liquidity to survive. In July of 2011, Kodak put those patents on the market. For months, no serious buyer appeared. The company that had once been worth $31 billion was trying to sell the intellectual legacy of its greatest achievements and could not find anyone willing to pay what they were asking. The clock was running out, and this time there was no yellow box that could save it. At 1 in the morning on January 19, 2012, Eastman Kodak Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of New York. The timing was not accidental. Filing in the middle of the night, before the markets opened, before the morning news cycle began, gave the company's communications team a few hours to prepare statements, brief journalists, and shape the narrative before Rochester woke up to find that the institution at the center of its civic identity had formally declared itself unable to pay its debts. The company listed approximately $5.1 billion in assets against $6.75 billion in liabilities. The gap between those two numbers represented the accumulated cost of 30 years of decisions that had prioritized the present over the future, and the future had finally arrived to collect. CEO Antonio Perez issued a statement that morning describing the bankruptcy filing as a proactive measure, a tool to strengthen the company's balance sheet, resolve legacy liabilities, and position Kodak for a sustainable future in commercial printing and imaging services. The language was careful and forward-looking and entirely disconnected from what the people of Rochester were feeling as they read it over their morning coffee. Tom Richards, the mayor of Rochester, chose his words with the particular precision of a politician trying to hold a community together. He described the filing as more of a psychological blow than an economic one, noting that Kodak's local payroll had already shrunk from its peak of 400 in the early 1980s to fewer than 7,000 by the time the bankruptcy was filed. The economic damage, he said, had been happening for decades. What was new was the finality of it. The finality was what hit people. In Rochester, the reaction was not the explosive public grief of a sudden catastrophe. It was something quieter and in many ways harder to bear. The particular sadness of a loss that everyone had seen coming and had spent years hoping would not arrive. A journalist from a local public television station walked through the city that morning and described the mood as a mixture of mild shock, deep sadness, and a bitterness directed specifically at the parade of outside executives who had come and gone through Kodak's leadership over the previous decade, collected their compensation packages, and left the company smaller and weaker than they had found it. The people of Rochester had watched their city's defining institution be managed into the ground by men who did not stay long enough to see the consequences of their decisions. That particular anger had nowhere useful to go, and so it sat. For the roughly 25,000 Kodak retirees living in the Rochester area, the bankruptcy filing triggered an immediate and deeply personal anxiety. Their pensions, governed by federal ERISA regulations, were reasonably well-funded and protected. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation confirmed that Kodak's retirement plan stood at 86% funding at the time of the filing, and the agency moved quickly to assure retirees that their basic benefits were secure. But healthcare coverage for retirees who were not yet old enough to qualify for Medicare was a different matter entirely. That coverage was funded from operating revenue, not from a protected trust, and it was immediately at risk. For thousands of people who had spent 20 and 30 years at Kodak and had planned their post-retirement lives around the assumption that the company would continue to provide what it had promised, the filing was not an abstraction. It was a letter arriving in the mail that told them the agreement they had built their lives around was no longer fully in force. Carlos Rowe, who had spent 10 years at Kodak before the bankruptcy, captured the feeling that many former employees were struggling to articulate. When you worked at Kodak, she said, you believed everything was going to be okay for life. That belief in the permanence of the institution, in the reliability of the promises it had made, was not naivety. It was a reasonable conclusion drawn from a century of evidence. Kodak had survived the Great Depression. It had survived 2 world wars. It had survived the rise of Japanese competition and the collapse of the film market in a decade of restructuring. The people who had given their working lives to it had every rational reason to believe it would outlast them. The fact that it had not was not their failure. It was the failure of the men at the top who had known for years what was happening and had not found a way to stop it. The unraveling of the physical company had actually been underway for years before the bankruptcy filing made it official. Between 2003 and 2011, Kodak had shut down 13 manufacturing plants and closed 130 photo processing labs across the United States. The processing labs were perhaps the most visible loss to ordinary Americans outside of Rochester. The places where the yellow envelopes had been prepared, where the negatives had been developed, where the finished prints had been sorted and packaged and sent back to the families who had trusted Kodak with their memories. One by one, those labs had gone dark. The ritual of dropping a film canister at the pharmacy counter on a Tuesday and picking up your photographs the following week had already been fading for years, displaced first by 1 hour processing, and then by the digital camera, and then by the camera phone. By 2012, it was nearly gone. The bankruptcy simply acknowledged what the culture had already decided. In June of 2009, more than 2 years before the bankruptcy filing, Kodak had made an announcement that generated more genuine public mourning than almost any corporate decision in recent American history. After 74 years of continuous production, Kodak was discontinuing Kodachrome film. The color film that Paul Simon had immortalized, that National Geographic had used to document the world, that had colored the family memories of 3 generations of Americans, would no longer be manufactured. The announcement ran in major newspapers across the country. Professional photographers wrote elegies. Amateur photographers wrote letters. The single remaining facility in the world capable of processing Kodachrome film, Dwayne's Photo, a small independent lab in Parsons, Kansas, announced that it would continue to accept rolls for development until December 30th, 2010, and then it would process the last batch and close the Kodachrome line forever. In the weeks leading up to that deadline, photographers drove to Parsons from across the country. Some had been shooting Kodachrome for 40 years. Some had never shot it before, but wanted to be part of the ending. They mailed their final rolls from post offices across America, and they drove their final rolls through the flat Kansas landscape to a small building where the last people on Earth who knew how to process Kodachrome film were waiting to receive them. On December 30th, 2010, Dwayne's Photo developed the last roll of Kodachrome ever processed. The photographer was Steve McCurry, the National Geographic photojournalist who had taken the famous 1984 portrait of the Afghan girl, one of the most recognized photographs in the history of the magazine, shot on Kodachrome film. The last image on the last roll was a portrait of a local Parsons resident. It was not a famous image. It did not need to be. What it was an ending. During the bankruptcy proceedings that followed the January 2012 filing, Kodak sold its patent portfolio, more than 1,000 patents representing a century of genuine scientific achievement, to a consortium of technology companies that included Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Samsung, for approximately $525 million. The companies that had built the digital world Kodak had failed to enter were now purchasing the intellectual foundations of the analog world Kodak had created. There was a symmetry to it that was almost too neat to be believed, and yet there it was, documented in court filings and press releases, the final transaction of an empire in the process of liquidating its own legacy. On September 3, 2013, 19 months after the bankruptcy filing, Kodak emerged from Chapter 11 as a reorganized company. It was a fundamentally different entity from the one that had filed. The consumer photography business was gone. The digital camera line was gone. The inkjet printer business was gone. The film processing operations had been spun off into a separate company called Kodak Alaris as part of a settlement with the United Kingdom's Kodak pension plan. What remained was a commercial printing and imaging services company focused on business clients, a legitimate enterprise professionally managed with real customers and real revenue, but bearing almost no resemblance to the company that had put a camera in every American household and a yellow box in every kitchen drawer. The Kodak that emerged from bankruptcy in 2013 employed approximately 8,800 people worldwide. At its peak, it had employed 145,300. In Rochester, where the company had once sustained 60,000 jobs and funded the civic infrastructure of an entire city, it now ranks 16th among local employers. The building at Kodak Park where George Eastman had built his original manufacturing operation still stood. Much of the surrounding campus had been demolished or converted to other uses. The railroad connections were gone. The company fire department was gone. What had once been the most productive industrial site in upstate New York was now called Eastman Business Park, a landlord of mixed-use commercial space, leasing square footage to the small companies that had moved into the spaces left behind by the largest employer the region had ever known. What exactly did we lose on that cold January morning when the lights finally went out? The question does not have a clean answer. What was lost was not just a company or a product or even a brand. What was lost was a particular American confidence. The confidence that the things we built, when we built them well and built them honestly and built them for people who needed them, would last. Kodak had lasted for 132 years. It had survived everything the 20th century could throw at it. And then it had been undone, not by a competitor who made better film, but by the digital future it had seen coming and chosen not to meet. The yellow boxes are gone from the pharmacy shelves. The processing labs are dark. The carousel projectors sit in attic boxes or on the shelves of antique stores, waiting for someone who remembers what they were for. When Kodak emerged from bankruptcy in September of 2013, the photography world it had built was essentially gone. The consumer film market, which had generated the margins that sustained the company for nearly a century, had collapsed from a peak of roughly 1 billion rolls sold annually in the United States to a fraction of that number. The one-hour photo lab at the corner drugstore, a Kodak invention, a Kodak institution, the physical location where 3 generations of Americans had handed over their memories and trusted a yellow envelope to bring them back, had largely disappeared from American retail. The camera phone had finished what the digital camera had started. By 2012, more photographs were being taken every 2 minutes than had existed in total in the entire world before 1900. None of them required film. None of them required Kodak. The company that emerged from Chapter 11 was a commercial printing and imaging services business serving corporate clients. It had real operations, real revenue, and a legitimate place in the B2B marketplace. But it was not Kodak in any sense that the people who had grown up with the yellow box would have recognized. The brand name remained. The yellow and red logo remained. Everything else had been restructured, sold, spun off, or simply discontinued. The patents that had represented a century of scientific achievement, the intellectual property that engineers and chemists in Rochester had spent their careers generating, had been sold to the consortium of Silicon Valley companies for $525 million. Apple, Google, and Facebook now own the foundations of Kodak's innovation legacy. The heirs of the digital revolution had purchased the estate of the analog era at a bankruptcy auction, and the price per patent worked out to roughly what a mid-range smartphone cost at retail. Kodak Alaris, the spin-off company created from the businesses transferred to the United Kingdom's Kodak pension plan as part of the bankruptcy settlement, continued to operate in the areas of film, photo paper, and document scanning. It was, in a technical sense, the entity that kept the photographic film tradition alive under the Kodak name. For a time in the mid-2010s, it appeared that even this remnant might disappear. Film production at the Rochester facility had been scaled back to levels that seemed barely viable. The darkroom community, the art photography world, and the small but passionate analog revival movement watched anxiously to see whether any version of Kodak film would survive into the next decade. It did, but not in the way anyone had predicted. Beginning around 2012 and accelerating through the mid-2010s, something unexpected happened in American photography. Young people who had grown up entirely in the digital era began shooting film. Not because they lacked access to digital cameras. They had more powerful cameras in their pockets than any professional photographer of the 1970s could have imagined. But because film offered something that digital did not: the imperfection, the grain, the commitment of a medium that could not be instantly reviewed and deleted and reshot until the moment looked the way you wanted it to look. The analog revival was driven by artists, by film students, by photographers in their 20s who had never loaded a roll of film in their lives and found the process revelatory. Kodak film production, which had been shrinking toward extinction, began to stabilize, and then carefully and incrementally to grow. By the late 2010s, Kodak Alaris was reporting increased demand for color-negative film. Kodak Professional Ektachrome, discontinued in 2012, was relaunched in 2018 to genuine market enthusiasm. It was a revival, but it was also a reclassification. Film photography had moved from mass-market necessity to artisanal choice, from the yellow box at the pharmacy to the specialty camera store, from the family vacation to the fine arts program. The people buying Kodak film in 2020 were not buying it because it was the only option. They were buying it because they had chosen it deliberately, in the same way that people choose vinyl records over streaming or handwritten letters over email. The ritual had survived, but the scale had not. The mass market was gone. What remained was a community, dedicated and growing, but a fraction of the size that Kodak had once served. In Rochester, the aftermath of the bankruptcy continued to reshape the city long after the court proceedings ended. Between 2007 and 2018, economists calculated that the GDP losses attributable to Kodak's decline erased the growth generated by every other sector of the Rochester economy combined. The jobs that replaced Kodak's manufacturing workforce were largely lower-paying service positions. The neighborhoods that had housed 3 generations of Kodak workers saw property values decline and poverty rates rise. The University of Rochester and the Rochester Regional Health System became the city's dominant employers, institutions that George Eastman had helped endow a century earlier, now carrying the civic weight that his company could no longer bear. Eastman Business Park, the vast industrial campus that had once been the most productive photographic manufacturing site in the world, became a landlord. Its enormous buildings were subdivided and leased to dozens of small companies in fields ranging from food production to optics to renewable energy. Some of those companies were directly descended from Kodak's technological legacy, startups founded by former Kodak engineers, drawing on the deep pool of optical and chemical expertise that the company had concentrated in Rochester over a century. The city's identity as a center of imaging science did not disappear when Kodak collapsed. It fragmented into smaller pieces, distributed across a landscape of smaller companies that lacked the scale and the cultural weight of the institution they had replaced, but that kept something of its technical DNA alive. The broader American business world had been processing the lessons of Kodak's failure for years before the bankruptcy filing made them official. Clayton Christensen's theory of the innovator's dilemma, the idea that successful companies are systematically unable to respond to disruptive technologies because doing so requires destroying the very business model that made them successful, found in Kodak its most perfectly documented example. The case was taught in MBA programs at Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton. It appeared in management consulting presentations, in technology industry keynotes, in the strategic planning sessions of companies across every sector that feared they might be the next organization to be disrupted by the future they had already seen coming. The phrase Kodak moment had lived a double life for decades. In its original meaning, it was warmth and light, a moment so beautiful or so fleeting that it deserved to be captured and kept. In its second meaning, which had emerged gradually through the 2000s and crystallized fully after the bankruptcy, it meant something darker. A Kodak moment was the moment a company failed to recognize that the world had changed irrevocably and that its survival required it to change with equal decisiveness. The phrase had been born as an advertisement for memory. It had become a warning about complacency. Both meanings were accurate. Both meanings were, in their different ways, true to the history of the company that had inspired them. What do we lose when a brand like this disappears? When something so completely woven into the fabric of daily life, so present in the rituals of 3 generations, so fundamental to how an entire culture understood the act of remembering, simply stops being there? The question is not rhetorical in the way that most rhetorical questions are. It is a question with a real answer, even if the answer is difficult to hold in a single thought. What we lose is the particular form of trust that only comes from a century of consistent presence. The trust that the thing you reached for when something mattered, when your child took a first step, when your parents looked old for the first time, when the summer afternoon was so perfect that you needed proof it had existed, would be there, reliable and familiar and unchanged, in the same yellow box it had always been in. That trust, once broken, does not transfer to a successor. It simply ends. And what fills the space it leaves is not replacement, but absence. A gap in the texture of daily life that most people never name, but that many people, if they stop and think about it, can still feel. Picture a summer afternoon in 1973. A man stands in the film aisle of a drugstore somewhere in Middle America, Ohio maybe, or Indiana, or any of 100 towns that looked more or less the same in those years. He is buying film before a family vacation. He reaches for the yellow box without looking at it, the way you reach for something you have always reached for because it has always been there, and you have never had reason to think about whether it would be. The box is warm in his hand. The red lettering is crisp and familiar. He puts it in his basket alongside the sunscreen and the road snacks and does not give it another thought. Outside in the station wagon, his children are arguing about who gets the window seat. His wife is folding the road map. The dog is in the back. The vacation has not started yet, and already it is perfect. He does not know that he is about to make something permanent. He does not know that the photographs he will take over the next 2 weeks, his daughter at the edge of the Grand Canyon, his son asleep in the back seat with his mouth open, his wife laughing at something he said that he will not remember saying, will outlast the station wagon and the dog and eventually him. He does not know any of that. He only knows that he needs film, and the film is Kodak. And Kodak is the yellow box. And the yellow box is simply what film is. There is no decision being made. There is only the reaching. That is what Kodak was at its best. Not a choice, a certainty. For nearly a century, Eastman Kodak Company was the institution that Americans trusted with the moments they could not afford to lose. It was there at the birthday party with the brownie camera. It was there in the living room on Christmas morning with the Instamatic. It was there in the slide carousel clicking through the summer vacation on a dark November evening when the summer felt very far away. It was there in the yellow envelope at the pharmacy, a little fatter than expected, containing the proof that the moments you had lived were real and had existed and would continue to exist as long as someone was alive to hold the prints and remember. What Kodak sold was not chemistry. It was not optics. It was not even photographs. It was the assurance that the present moment was worth saving, that ordinary life, lived by ordinary people in ordinary places, deserved a record, that your life specifically was worth remembering. That conviction did not begin in a boardroom. It began in a kitchen in Rochester, New York, in the late 1870s, where a young man who had grown up without much and lost his father early and left school at 14 was staying up past midnight mixing chemicals on his mother's table because he believed, with the irrational certainty of the genuinely driven, that photography was too important to belong only to the wealthy and the professional. George Eastman did not set out to build an empire. He set out to solve a problem. The empire was the consequence of how completely and how honestly he solved it. You press the button, we do the rest. 7 words that changed the visual culture of the modern world, written by a man who understood that the highest form of service was to remove every obstacle between a person and the thing they needed to do. What Kodak built over the century that followed was something that no single metric can capture. It was a system of trust, constructed photograph by photograph, roll by roll, yellow box by yellow box, across 132 years and 3 generations of American families. It was the brownie camera under the Christmas tree in 1952, small enough for a child to hold. It was the Kodachrome slide of a backyard barbecue in 1967, its color so warm and saturated that looking at it decades later feels less like viewing a photograph than like stepping briefly back into the afternoon itself. It was the Instamatic on the graduation stage in 1978, the flash cube popping in the gymnasium light. It was the 1-hour photo lab where a woman in 1985 handed over her canister with the particular mixture of anticipation and vulnerability that comes from having trusted a machine with something irreplaceable and not yet knowing whether the trust was warranted. It was all of those things, and it was the people, the engineers and the chemists and the factory workers and the processing technicians and the 60,000 Rochester residents who built their lives around the company that had been built around them. Those people deserved better than what happened to them. The workers who spent 30 years on the production floor and watched the plant close around them. The retirees who had planned their lives around promises that the bankruptcy proceedings could not fully honor. The engineers who had seen the future clearly and been told to put it away. The city that had given itself entirely to one institution and paid the full price of that dependence when the institution could no longer sustain the weight of what it had promised. They are the human cost of the story, and they should not be footnotes in a business school case study. They were people who went to work every day and did their jobs and believed reasonably and honestly that the company would keep its end of the agreement. The agreement was broken above their heads by decisions made in rooms they were not invited into, and the consequences landed on them. George Eastman died in 1932, long before any of this. He left behind a note of 7 words in a company that he had built to last. He left behind the Eastman School of Music and the University of Rochester Medical Center and the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra and a mansion on East Avenue that became a museum to the art he had spent his life making accessible to everyone. He left behind a word he had invented with his mother on a kitchen table, a word that became synonymous in every language on earth with the act of capturing a moment before it disappeared. Tonight, somewhere, someone is opening a box of old photographs. They are sitting at a kitchen table, or on the floor of a bedroom, or in an attic where the light comes through a small window and falls at an angle across the stacks of prints. The photographs are from the 1970s or the 1980s, and the colors are warm in the way that only Kodachrome colors are warm, deep and saturated, and somehow more golden than the original afternoons could possibly have been. They show people who are older now, or gone. They show places that have changed. They show a version of ordinary American life that felt unremarkable when it was happening and feels now like something worth protecting. Whoever is holding those photographs did not take them to preserve history. They took them because they had a camera and a yellow box of film and a moment in front of them that seemed worth keeping. It was. It always was. That is what Kodak knew from the very beginning, before anyone else knew it. And that is what no bankruptcy filing, no restructuring plan, no successor technology can ever entirely take away. The photographs are still there. The colors are still warm. The moments are still real. Somewhere in a box in an attic in Ohio or Indiana or any of 100 towns that looked more or less the same in those years, the summer of 1973 is still happening, still golden, still perfectly intact. Kodak put it there, and it will be there long after the last yellow box is gone.